So if you think of memory as just being anything where you're change the way that you act in the world as a result of an event that happened in the past, that opens a huge floodgates of many different things that you can look at. And it can be very hard to draw a very clean boundary between different sorts of memory and the way that the nervous system then reacts to them in these different ways. So there are lots of important, interesting ideas that from the computational world about how to think about these memories. And so I think it's a very active area at the moment.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Neuroscience and Beyond podcast. I'm Svilen, your host. Together with my amazing team of graduate students, we're on a mission to bring the wonders of science, especially neuroscience, closer to you. In this episode, we have the distinct privilege of speaking with Professor Peter Dayan, Director at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen, Germany. Professor Dayan is renowned for using methods from machine learning to understand brain function, particularly linking neurotransmitter levels to prediction errors and uncertainty. His pioneering work in reinforcement learning and co-development of the Qt learning algorithm have shaped the field of computational neuroscience in profound ways. He is also the co-author of the highly influential textbook Theoretical Neuroscience and co-founder of the prestigious Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit. In 2012, Professor Dayan received the Rumelhart Prize, and in 2017, he was awarded the Brain Prize. On a personal note, it was truly an immense honor to sit down with such a brilliant mind like Professor Dayan. He was incredibly kind and generous with his time, staying with us until 10:30 p.m. to answer all of our questions. Join us as we explore decision-making, learning, and memory from a computational perspective. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this podcast is a separate activity from my position at the University Medical Center Göttingen in Germany. This podcast is supported by the International Max Planck Research School for Neurosciences, the Cluster of Excellence Multiscale Bioimaging, and the European Neuroscience Institute in Göttingen. If you'd like to support us, please subscribe to our channel and do not hesitate to drop us a comment under our videos. This episode was recorded during the New Horizons conference in Göttingen. And now, dear listeners, please enjoy the conversation with Professor Peter Dayan. Dear listeners, by the time of this recording, New Horizons is going on in Göttingen, up the hill. We had the pleasure to extend invitation to Professor Peter Dayan, who accepted kindly. And now I'm very, very, very happy, grateful, and it's an immense honor to have you, Professor Dayan, on our podcast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Actually, nice to be in Göttingen again.
There are so many topics that I would like to discuss with you. You're a person who contributed a lot to the field of neuroscience, especially theoretical computational neuroscience, also artificial intelligence, and many other topics. However, we don't have the time to cover all of the aspects. And I would just like to mention some of the things that I would like to discuss with you throughout our conversation. And of course, this would be the topic of learning and memory, decision-making, machine learning, and the intersection between artificial intelligence and neuroscience, how both fields benefit from each other. Before we touch upon these topics, can you please tell us what actually theoretical neuroscience is? I'm a biologist, and I would love to know, how do you approach the brain from theoretical frame?
Okay, that's a big question, as you well know. So I think the best way to think about it is that almost all sciences have their theoretical counterparts, because often in science what we're trying to do is to formalize hypotheses. We have hypotheses about how the world works, and then we're very fortunate to be able to use mathematics and basically mathematical thinking to formalize those hypotheses so we can do very crisp tests. Now, typically, everybody who's doing a hypothesis-driven experiment has in their mind a sort of model of how the system they're looking at works in a way. And in the case of neuroscience, that's exactly true. We have very complicated models and model theories that we have of how the brain might be working, or how different bits of the brain might be working, or how different functions may be subserved. And so theoretical neuroscience by itself is just the theoretical thinking that goes along with that. Now, in the case of neuroscience, and actually much of biology as a whole, we're luckier than you are in other sorts of natural sciences, because the brain does things, right? It's there as a computational device. We can think of it as doing information processing. That's not the only way to look at it, but it's a good way to look at it because we want to solve problems that we consider to be information processing problems. We're taking in sensory input from the world, and we're making decisions, we're doing choices, we're doing motor actions and so forth in order to prosper for ourselves in the world. And that means that in theoretical neuroscience, we have essentially what amounts to almost like a parallel stream of way of thinking about how the brain might work by thinking, what does it mean to process information in that particular way? So like any other natural science, we can formalize at many different scales. We have mechanistic models and descriptive models and so forth, like all sciences. But in the case of the brain, because we're trying to build an understanding of how it actually does important functions, we can use our understanding about functions to try and help us constrain those models. So in some sense, we're luckier. We have all these constraints, and that's what we're trying to do. So my own field is mostly decision-making, and so we know a lot about what it means to make a good decision or a bad decision. And so you can say, okay, well, if I were a good quality system, if I've evolved to be good at sort of surviving in a world full of threats and opportunities, then we know we can formalize what it means to do that, and we can use that formalism to help us build theories about how bits of the brain do those subserve functions.
Mm-hmm. So you're working on the theoretical perspective, and you develop these models and algorithms, if you wish, and ideas, hypotheses. Do you also use some experimental setups? Do you test your ideas somehow with biologists, let's say clinicians or other type of scientists?
Yes, great question. So in fact, we do all of the above. So we do some experiments ourselves. So I've historically worked with people doing imaging experiments, both in fMRI and in humans, fMRI and also MEG. So we can talk about that maybe later a little bit. And then therefore now in my own lab, we now do a lot of online psychological experiments. So there's been another sort of move in the field in psychology. It's been the availability of platforms like mTurk or Prolific or a number of other platforms like that, whereby you can give sort of simple psychological tasks to people. And the advantage of that is you can get a much wider group of people doing these tasks than you could ever have in the lab. And so whereas in the lab, you would tend to have psychology students, of course, because they're the people who are closest by, or students at universities. And now we can do it online. We can sort of democratize that aspect. There's a lot of interest in understanding how that works. So that's one group of things. And then I also have, throughout my career, have been privileged to collaborate with a lot of different people working in many different animal model systems. Mm-hmm. And so that we can then test fairly directly some of the theories that we have, and of course then you want to refine and refute the theories. That's the best aspect of science, is when these things don't quite work, and then you learn something really interesting and new.
That's great. I mean, of course, this is the right way to do science, right? Have a hypothesis, test it, draw conclusions, and the collaboration aspect is very, very meaningful and also needed in neuroscience, since it is such a complex field and you can approach the problems from many, many, many perspectives. So you've mentioned that you are working on decision making right now. But before we are going to this topic, can we please discuss learning? Since you are one of the co-inventors of Q-learning paradigm, which is a cornerstone of the reinforcement learning, one of the bases of machine learning, if you want. Can you tell us more about this concept?
Okay, so in some sense, we need to look back before Q-learning. So we need to look back to around the middle part of the last century, so around the 1950s. And that was a time when psychologists, mathematical psychologists, were interested in characterizing the learning that they saw in their animals. And at the same time, engineers were interested in understanding what learning systems might be. How can they get a system to learn about how to do control in the world, for instance? And so, in fact, if you look back now, you can see that some of the theoretical developments they were doing were actually rather in parallel. There's a very influential paper by sort of the heroes of reinforcement learning, Andy Bartow and Rich Sutton, in the early 80s, where they pointed out that one of the key ideas formalizing learning in psychology, called the Ruskall-Wagner rule, I'll talk about that in a minute, is actually exactly the same as one of the key early learning ideas in engineering, called the Delta rule, and which was done by Widrow and Hoff. So that you can see that these areas were really very close together at that time, and they sort of then split apart and they sort of came back together. Anyhow, so the Ruskall-Wagner rule, which is what the psychology version of the Delta rule, is essentially a really simple idea, which says that if you want to learn how to do a prediction to predict, the best signal you could have is a prediction error. What's wrong with your current prediction? And so in very simple cases, you can think of that as just being the difference between two quantities. What actually happened, what you predicted happened, right? If you're predicting an amount of reward, if you get more reward than you expected, then you want to increase your prediction. So the prediction error is positive. If you got less reward than you expected, you want to decrease your prediction. The prediction error is negative. So Sutton and Bartow had this influential paper. Rich Sutton, when he was a undergraduate himself, had already been working a lot on aspects of formalizing, thinking about mathematical psychology and formalizing in various terms. And so they did this very influential paper looking at that. And then they identified an interesting problem, which comes up in understanding some psychological data, and also comes up in thinking about what a task you should do in the world. And then psychological data, it comes down to paradigms which are known as secondary conditioning. So those are paradigms where you can show that if one stimulus, let's say a light, predicts a reward that happens in the future, then if you show another stimulus, let's say a tone, that predicts the light, then animals seem to, under many circumstances, conclude that the tone also predicts reward, even though that tone was not directly associated with reward. And so that tells us that our notion of prediction isn't what happens in the Rescordo-Wagner rule. Because if you think about what happens there, you have to have the reward to predict the reward. If you don't have the reward, you can't do that. And simultaneously, in the context of decision-making tasks, what Sutton and Bartow are pointing out is that we are interested in solving tasks where you don't immediately find out what reward you get, but you only find out later. So, for instance, imagine you're playing a game of chess. You make a move in chess. Was that a good move or a bad move? Well, it might have been a terrible move. Every other move you do in the game might be the perfect move you could do, but you're still going to lose the game at the end. And so, in the end, you don't care about the immediate reward you get, which in a game of chess, unless you get checkmate or either mated yourself or the other person, or you mate the other person, you don't find out instantly what happens. You have to wait until the end, and that characterizes almost every decision-making problem that we really care about. And so what Rich Sutton did was develop an algorithm called temporal difference learning, which crystallizes that particular idea. It says that at the computational formulation of what it is we thought that we were trying to do is wrong for these cases, wrong in the Delta rule, wrong in the Rescordo-Wagner rule. We need to have a different formulation of learning, which is trying to predict not just the immediate reward, but the sum of all these rewards that are going to come in the future. And that means the algorithm we need to have is also different, because the thing we're trying to do is different as well. So he then formulated the temporal difference learning algorithm. So then Chris Watkins, in his thesis in 1989, then invented Q-learning. So in fact, he's the inventor of Q-learning. And so he also made a link between, a link that Andy and Rich had not really quite made in quite these ways, to dynamic programming. In fact, there's another investigator called Paul Werbos, who also had been interested in exactly this link as well. And so Chris understood the relationship between dynamic programming and these ideas, and that's really sort of understood in a very rich way by a huge body of people since then. And so then he formalized that, and he noted that then there's a sort of technical aspect of Q-learning which is enabled by the way that particular algorithm works. It's a little bit complicated, so it doesn't make sense necessarily to describe it here, but it's sort of a beautiful aspect of that theory, which also means that formally that it can work in what's called off-policy. It means that you don't have to be following your policy, the usual way you go about making actions. You can still learn what the optimal way to behave is in Q-learning. And so essentially, really what you're doing, technically, really, is swapping over. So you have an expected value, so like you're trying to average things in the world, and you have a non-linearity, which is the maximum. You're trying to find the best action you need to do. And so you can think about an expected value over a maximum of something, to work out what the best action is, or you can have a maximum over expected values. So it turns out that one way you can do easily, and the other way you can't do easily when you just take samples from the world. And Chris understood that, and he understood how it is then in Q-learning we can then sort of do the right way around, and that's what Q-learning. That was the trick essentially, or the insight inside Q-learning. And then my involvement in Q-learning is I was involved in just a little bit, just a really minor thing in terms of the proof of Q-learning, that Q-learning converged appropriately. Something that Chris had worked on in his thesis, and then we wrote this paper together. And then indeed Q-learning was a very influential algorithm at the time, because people could see how you could use it, and it was influential both because of the beauty of what Chris's insights into the problem itself, and also because of this link to dynamic programming. It suddenly opened the floodgates of people thinking, well, now we can use stochastic approximation theory. There's a whole body of work in operations research and economics, and lots of people had used dynamic programming, which is this formal way in engineering and operation OR and stats and stuff like that, in order to understand how to solve these long distance problems when you're trying to optimize reward, not immediately, but over the long run. And so this was then all became available essentially. And then the next thing that we were interested in doing is then looking at, well, if this is a good way of solving problems itself, we had this in the back of our minds. And then Reid Montague and I, when we were postdocs in Terry Sinofsky's lab, were then interested in the neural underpinnings. what are animals doing when they're learning from rewards in the same way that we might think of systems of learning from rewards as well. So we had the psychology of it, but of course that's not the neuroscience. And so then we came across the data from Wolfram Schultz, and that's where we then modeled those data using this temporal difference learning ideas, because they seem to fit very well the activity of the key structures involved in those predictions, which is these dopamine neurons. And so that was the sort of the link, that's sort of the chain from the sort of 1950s away, which of course itself is based on stuff that happened earlier in the earlier part of the last century. Interestingly, so if you think of in the earlier part of the 19th century, there was already a sort of interesting debate between Edward Tolman and Edward Thorndike. So there's a difference between so Tolman is famously associated with what we would now consider to be sort of model-based reasoning. So he was interested in cognitive maps, right? How is it that we and animals build cognitive maps he had of the world and then use those maps to do planning? Thorndike is associated with this law of effect, where you tend to repeat actions that were associated with reinforcement. And so the early Q-learning and the Q-learning ideas are very much Thorndikian, essentially. So you have this generalized notion of what a reward is. It's not only a real reward, it can also be that those things are getting better. And that's the core idea in the temporal difference learning idea which also is there in Q-learning as well. And so then later on, then a lot of people got very interested in sort of model-based reinforcement learning. And now that we're also very interested in model-based reinforcement learning in the brain. And so now we're sort of bringing sort of Tolman and Thorndike together essentially again. So again, you can see that the psychologists had this very interesting ideas about how these systems should work. And then again, maybe just sort of completing this rather long circle is that ethologists, so if you think when we think in computational terms, often people refer to this work by David Marr, where you have the idea of a computational theory, an algorithmic theory, and implementation theory. Computational theory is what problem are you trying to solve? So we're trying to predict long-run rewards over a long period. The algorithmic theory for Marr is associated with what algorithm, what process model you're using, and then implementation is the implementation. So those partners, so computational theory partners with ethology, right there. How is it that animals are fit to the behavior they do? How does it fit to the niche that they occupy? The algorithmic theory is the process models, that's psychology, and then the implementation is neuroscience. And so the ethologists use exactly the same theories, the dynamic programming theories, to think about things like foraging that the reinforcement learning people now use, the engineering people use as well. So now the psychologists are using the same theory as the process models you see in algorithms. So that's the reinforcement learning algorithms we have, or that you see in operations research and so forth. And so then the implementation then is the neuroscience. So decision making is one of these areas where all these things really come together beautifully. And I think that's really has spurred a very fast development of this field compared to some other fields you see in neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating description of all the development, and we were having this discussion with another participant from Horizons that basically people take things for granted, but as Isaac Newton said once, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And everything has its time and era, and things happen to, there is a singularity if you want, and then, oh wow, we've made an amazing discovery. And it's just remarkable that these things happened at that time, and you and your collaborators were able to develop this theory, which helped actually learning more about the brain, and also develop very interesting algorithms that we use nowadays, as I said, in machine learning and artificial intelligence in general, right? So what was the driving force to switch kind of from learning to decision making? Was it this kind of merging of the different perspectives, or there was something else?
Interesting. So psychology has these two sort of broad streams in the learning world, right? There's Pavlovian learning and operant learning, or classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning. And so in some sense, the learning, what you call pure learning, is like the Pavlovian learning, right? So you think, well, that's not really good quality decision making. Right? The animal doesn't have to make any decision. It sits there, a light comes on, some food arrives. A light comes on, some food arrives, just doing prediction, right? And so now, of course, in the end, it does actually make decisions, but then it actually decides to go approach or withdraw depending on what it gets. But the decision-making is not essential for it to get the outcome. In operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning, the actions that it does have a big impact on whether it gets the reward, determine typically whether it gets the reward or not, at least whether it has a probability of getting a reward. So already, I was already interested in both operant and classical conditioning. Indeed, temporal difference learning itself was originally a prediction learning theory. Whereas Q-learning, and this maximization, it says, well, what action should I do in order to maximize the benefit of my outcome? That already is an operant and an action learning thing. So I was already interested in decision making, I say, already right from the early days. So I don't see them as being really quite so distinct, essentially. Now, of course, in decision making, when you look at the wider body of decision making, then it brings in a set of other things, a lot about notions of state, right? So uncertainty is absolutely critical in decision making because you think, do I have enough information to make a decision at that point? And so the reinforcement learning world has its own formalisms to think about that. So partially observable Markov decision processes, or POMDPs as we know them. And so I spent a long time sort of working on these POMDPs. Again, coming back to psychology. So psychology has developed some lovely thinking about these uncertain decision-making problems. So things like drift diffusion or models, or diffusion to bound models from people like Roger Ratcliffe, for instance, who's done those, and many other people have been involved in that work too. And you can see those. In fact, it relates to work that Turing did and work that Wald did in the war. So there's some lovely work that links those two from people actually like Mike Shadden, who are working in the thinking about the neuroscience of decision making in monkeys. In our way of thinking about that, we should just treat them as instances of general, partially observable Markov decision processes, because then we can then bring in a whole lot of extra sort of theoretical understanding to see what happens. Now, those algorithms, you think of the sort of DDM, it's like a process model, it's one of these algorithmic theories, if you like, and it's a optimum algorithm. It's the correct algorithm to use for a particular class of decision-making problems like this, where information comes in a very particular way. But of course, we don't know that animals aren't actually operating in those regimes typically. So it's one of these nice cases where you say, well, this is a great approximation, and it works in some particular ways. But then if we can understand sort of the wider body of context around it, mathematical context around it, then we can ask a richer set of questions about how it works in other cases too. And so that's then I've always thought of it in that way, where it's super important to use different sorts of heuristics, because the decisions that we want to make are radically computationally complicated, right? When you have uncertainty about the world, it turns out that the way you make decisions, the computational structure of that demands a huge amount of computational effort if you want to solve it exactly. And so we need to have different useful sort of heuristics. And so we have we understand some of these heuristics. And then the field of decision making has developed a bunch of heuristics, which then uses in these different ways. And so I think it's very important to think about those heuristics. It's also important to think about what they are heuristic to, essentially. And that then is the computational theory that lives on top of that. And that's what I've also been interested in.
So you mentioned the operant and the other type of classical conditioning, with Pavlovian, if you want. And a lot of experiments have been carried out in animals, right? So when, as a human beings, we think about decision making, right? You have these emotional states going on, you have this planning, you have some previous experiences. How do you define decision making in humans and in non-human animals, for example?
So, in general, there's a lot of continuity between non-human animals and humans in terms of the general way they make decisions. And so you already described like 2 or 3 different things, and we can talk about those 2 or 3 different things, like planning, memory that we have before, and maybe some immediate effect of reward. And we can think about all of those in animals too. And this then becomes super interesting to think about what that looks like in animals. So let's start off with planning, right? In some sense, that's the most sophisticated thing we think of humans as doing. And indeed, there are cases where we can plan. Think of classically, playing a game of chess or something. Thinking like a game. You try to think steps forward in the world. Now, people try to operationalize the same sorts of problems that require planning, a little bit of planning in that way in animals. Indeed, this is what Tom was interested in, in his cognitive maps in men and animals. Basically, he was interested exactly in this thing. And so he was being criticized by some psychologists at the time, saying, he's leaving animals, quote, buried in thought. And so we have evidence about the sorts of some evidence about the sorts of planning that animals can do. We know something about the neural substrates of that planning, and then And then, things like, people think about things like pre-play or in the hippocampus, so different sorts of rhythms in the hippocampus which may be involved in some aspects of this. And we think about other algorithms that animals are doing. And indeed, Tolman was very interested in the cognitive maps. Once you have a map, a map is a nice structure to have, but what you really want to do with a map is planning. And so that's exactly what Tolman was interested in doing, and he was then trying to design experiments to look at those things. And then take Pavlovian conditioning. So we go to the other extreme, where Pavlovian conditioning, where you just say, well, this is what's happening there is that I make a prediction about some aspect of the world because I see a cue, and there's a set of actions which are automatically elicited by that prediction. So, for instance, if I see something which predicts future reward, I tend to approach and engage with it. If I see something which predicts punishment, I tend to withdraw and remove myself from it. So we did a test in humans, so working with Mark Guicart-Massip and using basically a design that came from Molly Crockett. We did what we call the orthogonalized go-no-go task, if I might just describe it briefly. Mm-hmm. So what we wanted to do was to essentially pit instrumental conditioning against Pavlovian conditioning to see how powerful Pavlovian conditioning is in humans, right? So, and it's something you can do in animals too. So the idea is the following. We have 4 conditions. The one condition, you get rewarded if you make an active response in response to a cue. Mm-hmm. Another condition is you avoid a punishment if you make an active response to a cue. Mm-hmm. Third condition is you avoid a punishment if you do nothing in response to a cue. And the fourth condition, as you might imagine, is you get a reward if you do nothing in response to a cue. Mm. So from a rational point of view, there's nothing different about any of these quadrants. There's an operant action you should do. There's a correct thing, either go or no go. So do something, go. Avoid doing something, no go. And in some cases you get a reward. That's good. Other cases you avoid a punishment. That's also good. So you should just do that. So we might expect good quality humans to do exactly the right thing. But from a perspective of Pavlovian instrumental conditioning, something different happens. Because there, as I mentioned, if you have a cue which predicts reward, you tend to engage and act actively towards it. And the concomitantly, so the converse of that is if you have a cue which predicts a punishment, you tend to withdraw and withhold in that case. So we can predict that 2 of these actions combinations should be easy. So go to get a reward should be easy because the cue says you like to go because it's a positive and you get a reward, which is also good for doing it. And no go, so do nothing in order to avoid a punishment should be easy too, because then that's also congruent essentially, where Pavlovian and instrumental contingencies are congruent. But the other 2, they're incongruent, right? Mm-hmm. So one says you have to do something actively to avoid a punishment. So the punishment, the prediction of a punishment makes you want to stop, so that's going to be a little bit difficult. And then the fourth one, you think that's the easiest one possible. A cue comes up, you do nothing, you get a reward. So it turns out that that's the most difficult one for our human subjects to learn. So we did a task where we had each of these contingencies, and a third of our subjects, or our participants in this study, in I think 40 trials, never learned not to go in order to get a reward. So they always, even though they were basically reducing their own reward. So that shows that although you might think that we are, capable of beating our Pavlovian, our inner Pavlov, we are not. And so we suffer from some of these same problems. And so I wrote a paper with some colleagues. We called it Pavlovian misbehavior, basically. So there's a misbehavior that comes because of these things. And we think it's actually very important for a number of different, even psychiatric conditions as well. Mm-hmm. And if you think of yourself maybe on a diet, for instance, then you find yourself, if you walk past a bakery store where there's this beautiful smell of cream cakes wafting out of the door, you find yourself, even though you might be on a diet, you find yourself having finished this cream cake that you then couldn't help yourself but buy. So now, of course, you're a good quality human, right? So you think, well, what I'm going to do is when I leave my home, I'm going to plan a huge route and huge detour around, so I don't tempt myself by the cream bun store. So we do have the capacity to beat off these Pavlovian instincts, and indeed, 2/3 of our subjects in the end they did learn how to do it. But we are still subject to them, and the more subject you are, and if you're distracted, you're doing a dual task, you're going to become more subject to it, and under certain psychiatric conditions, we think you're more subject to it too. So these are very powerful. We build these mechanisms that are inside our heads. We can't just avoid them, and they're there causing trouble, basically.
Remarkable and very interesting experiment. I don't know if my next question will make sense, but I would like to ask it right now. Can you relate this kind of behavior of not being able to learn to not do any action to get an award to the Kahneman and Tversky risk aversion theory?
Yeah, so we've been quite interested in different aspects of risk aversion, and I think that there's so what they were showing, like they have prospect theory, and there's obviously quite a rich domain in that case, and how much we like losses and so forth. So in their case, it was more like a sort of choice behavior, and indeed, people don't like losses, and I think that we've modeled risk. We tend to model risk in a slightly different way than that, but certainly. What you see in Kahneman and Tversky is that there are many anomalies of behavior, and that's they very richly looked at some of those anomalies of behavior, and some of those anomalies of behavior indeed come from some of these sort of mechanisms that we might think about, and in general they come from different sorts of heuristics. So this Pavlovian bias makes sense from a sort of evolutionary point of view, right? It makes perfect sense that you should try to engage with the reward. Another of my favorite experiments is this called the experiment by Hirschberger on like chickens in a looking glass world. So it goes like this: you have a chicken and a feeder, and it's set up that if the chicken runs towards the feeder runs away at twice the speed. If the chicken runs away from the feeder runs towards him at twice the speed. And so the way you get fed is by running as fast as you can away from your source of food. Needless to say, the chickens can't learn that. And there are other issues to that experiment. It was very cleverly done. So it's an interesting sort of bias that comes. But of course, you don't normally have to run away from your sources of food to get them, right? They don't normally come running after you to try and eat me, right? And so these mechanisms make sense when you think about them that way. But of course, it's very hard to piece together evolution, right? So the biologists are rightly very nervous about sort of evolutionary gesto stories. But in the end, we have a set of heuristics because the problems we're trying to solve are radically computationally complicated. Even the best computers in the world can't solve them optimally because they are too complicated. And so then we need to have heuristics. And those heuristics, of course, have adapted in a certain environment. And the trouble we face now, of course, is the environment that we occupy, that we now forge for ourselves in a modern world, is very different from the environment that these heuristics were originally designed for. And so they don't work so well in some cases. And then we can see those biases come out. And then Kahneman and Tversky, in some instances, are looking at some of the effects of those sorts of heuristics.
Mm-hmm. Where does the Bayesian inference comes to play in a role in this kind of aspect of decision making, for example? And can you maybe briefly explain what this is with the term Bayesian inference?
Yes.
Right?
Okay. So Bayesian inference is based on Bayes' rule. Bayes' rule was invented by Pascal, and there's the French always like to remind us, but also by Bayes. Well, he never actually wrote it down. It was written by somebody after him. And it's really a super simple piece of mathematics. And what it really is about is if you have some prior information about some aspect of the world, like some prior information that doing an action is going to give you a reward or not, you have some data about it. So you collect data by doing an experiment. You try the action, do you get reward or not? And then, given those two pieces of information, something a priori and some information there, you can then make some inferences about. Okay, well now a posterior says, well now how should I update my expectations about what's going to happen in the world? So that's just one instance of using Bayes' theorem, and that's why it's important decision making, because often we start out with some uncertainty. We're born ignorant in a way, and then we have some priors, and that's what the heuristics we talk about. These priors come perhaps from evolutionary programming, is a way of thinking about it. We then are able to collect some data for ourselves. That's sometimes called the likelihood, and then we generate posteriors. So we generate new expectations about what the world is going to be like based on Bayesian inference. So Bayesian inference plays many roles in this case, and indeed you can think of the whole of reinforcement learning, although we tend to think of reinforcement learning as being the whole problem, you can think of that as being another branch of Bayesian decision theory. It's just a particular interesting sort of branch of Bayesian decision theory. And and what you're doing is you're coupling your ability to make inferences about the world. That's when there's something uncertain. You have to say, well, now how do I incorporate this information to become less uncertain based on data I have, or more uncertain because I just discover that my expectations about the world are no longer true, and then use that to make decisions by essentially maximizing your gain or minimizing your loss if you think about losses rather than gains. So in a formal way, Bayesian decision theory is perfectly nested either inside, if you're a reinforcement learning chauvinist, or outside reinforcement learning if you're a Bayesian decision theorist chauvinist. So they all integrate extremely nicely together, and so that's indeed how you can think about it. And then some of the complexities come up in the exact way you're doing Bayesian inference and how you can do generate these posteriors and so forth. So in all those cases, it works very nicely. So when you're thinking about learning, for instance, just as one example, so we learn because there's something we don't know. If we knew everything, we wouldn't have to do any learning. And so Bayes Bayesian learning tells us, Bayesian decision theory or Bayesian inference tells us exactly what to do. If you're ignorant, because there's something you don't know, you're born ignorant or you have ignorance thrust upon you. It gets thrust upon you either because you've forgotten, right? That's a good way to become ignorant in the future, or because the world has changed, because therefore something has changed in the world. And that means in both those cases, you then have to do learning because you have this ignorance. And Bayesian reasoning or Bayesian updating in this case allows you to track that uncertainty in an appropriate way and then make inferences based on what that uncertainty is. So you can actually make then you can make inferences about what the world is, then you can make decisions based on those inferences essentially. And as I say, these all nest together nicely with respect to reinforcement learning. So there's a lot of Bayesian decision theory going on. Now, again, in many contexts, Bayesian decision theory is very computationally hard, and so we need to have approximations again. So that then we get dragged back again to what sort of approximations and heuristics we can do to try and do a reasonable job in a nasty and brutish world.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we can refer to the brain as a Bayesian inference or Bayesian predicting machine or pattern recognition machine?
So that's both too much and too little, in a way. So it's too much because to be a really Bayesian machine, as I just said, is actually impossible to be. Impossible given finite computational resources to do Bayesian inferences in most cases. So in many cases, the way we formalize a problem is to think about it in these Bayesian ways. And so it makes sense that we should think about what the information is, how it is you would learn about the world, and so forth. And then it forces you to be very crisp about the hypotheses that we have. And that could be a very useful way to design experiments and say, okay, well, if it was like this, we can predict you should be pushed around by manipulating this variable or that variable. And then Bayes tells us what that should look like. And in some cases, we are extremely good at doing, we as humans and other animals are extremely good at doing something a bit like Bayesian inference. And there are lots of cases where people have shown this, like in motor control. There's lovely work from people like Daniel Walpert in sensory decision making as well. But as soon as you push these to difficult problems, to really difficult problems, you can't be Bayesian because it's just too difficult to be Bayesian. So in some sense, it's too much because we can't achieve that. In other senses, it's too little because there's a lot of our interaction with the world isn't interestingly described as a Bayesian decision problem, right? There are lots of things that we have to do, controlling aspects of the environment, where there are uncertainties. But that's just the uncertainties aren't often the huge amount of difficulty we have. Instead, the issues of how do I develop policies in enough time, and how do I move in a rugged environment, things like that. There are lots of questions which aren't particularly illuminated by looking at them in this Bayesian world, even if underlying it there's something which you would love to be able to do some sort of Bayesian inference for. So we have to think more broadly than just in terms of Bayesian inference. But indeed, it's very good to have a core theory that helps us understand about some really critical issues. And so uncertainty is a lot of what we deal with. And one slight danger is it encourages us to think about simple problems because those are the ones where we can formalize the Bayesian decision theory. So there's a sort of drunk under the lamppost problem going on, which is we encourage to think about problems where we can reason in these Bayesian ways. We can ask what the optimum thing to do is. But of course, in reality, animals live in and we and other animals live in a much more complicated world where many of these Bayesian aspects are there. It's not that they're not there. It's just they're not the critical piece which is stopping us from understanding how things are working.
So it's like a very nice theoretical framework that gives us some perspective, and it's like a tool that we can use to add to our toolbox in order to better understand our brain and ourselves and our decision making, right? I wanted to ask you, so we were talking about learning, we were talking about decision making, these heuristics also experiences. How do you see memory?
Good question. So memory is... So there are many aspects of memory, again, that we have to think about in order to make this work. So we know there are different timescales of memory. There's organization, in fact, Bayesian ways of thinking about the organization of memory that we have. And then, the most critical aspect of memory, as many people point out, is that we don't have like just a tape of, which just stores like the tape in these cameras, which just stores a somewhat veridical aspect of what happens of everything that's happened to our past. We have this very reconstructive process of memory, which actually is much more like the Bayesian inference that we were just talking about. And we have to have this interesting balance between different sorts of memory that we have. And indeed, one of the things that we're actually working on at the moment is thinking a bit about some of the interaction between these different sorts of memory. So there's episodic memory, so memory for individual events that have happened in your past and maybe associated with mental time travel or something like Tolkien thinks about. You have semantic memory, which is your general knowledge in some sense about the declarative memory, so still things that you can articulate in your general knowledge about the world. And then you have procedural memory, which is your ability to act in environments where it's essentially implicit. You can't describe your ability to ride a bike. You can drive a bike. You know that if you put on a bike you could ride it, but you can't actually describe what you should do, like the centipede trying to work out which leg to move, as some people point out. Now, so the way that our memory is flawed, is a particularly important aspect in which we're not very like computers, right? So computers have the way that they store things, the way they index things is just much. They have much more availability in many different ways than we have. They can afford to have many different indices. They can afford to store absolutely everything that they have, and they can then sort of remix them and so forth in different ways in the future when they need to. We don't have that luxury. We get we have a chance to store things. Maybe we have like David Marr was into the idea that we sort of store things in the hippocampus temporarily. We have a consolidation process. The reason we actually heard one of the talks in New Horizons today about exactly the same thing, where you can then read it out to the cortex. But when you're reading it out to the cortex, you can't keep on referring to what was originally, you had the original structure of what that memory was. So I think there are some really interesting deviations in this episodic and semantic memory from what you would like to do if you had a different sort of memory device. But our memory is fantastic, or in general it's fantastic, considering our ability to index things and to recall things that it's only relatively recently with search engines and so forth that we've been dramatically bettered by computational devices. So I think there's still a lot to be understood about this structure and workings of these different sorts of memory and the interactions between them, why they should look the way they do, how we think about the inaccuracies in memory. And so there are some lovely theoretical ideas about that we and other people are working on as well.
There is, of course, the muscle memory, right? There's auditory memory and also other aspects.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. Yes. It's an incredible topic.
And also adaptation, right? Adaptation. So if you think of memory as just being anything where you're changed the way that you act in the world as a result of an event that happened in the past, that opens a huge floodgates of many different things that you can look at. And it can be very hard to draw a very clean boundary between different sorts of memory and the way that the nervous system then reacts to them in these different ways. So there are lots of important, interesting ideas that from the computational world about how to think about these memories. And so I think it's a very active area at the moment.
How do you think, what happens in the brain when we memorize, when we remember about something, and when we visualize, when we think about the future, for example? What is the difference in terms of computation, if you wish?
So one of the striking things that, in fact, Demis Hassabis worked on when he was before his World in DeepMind, when he was a PhD student with Alan Maguire, was this looking at the way that humans who have hippocampal deficits are impaired in thinking about the future just as much as they are impaired in thinking about the past, or in a related way to the way they're thinking about the past. So you ask them to imagine a future scene, like imagine a beach scene. So you and I could imagine this beautiful beach scene where you have, there's the pina coladas on the with the umbrellas, and the sea in front of you, gently lapping with the windsurfers out there. So it's very hard for people who have hippocampal deficits to imagine scenes in that way. And so that tells that experiment told us a bit about the fact that these things are rather coupled together, the way you think about the future and the way you think about the past. Now, visualization is complicated because you might think that we have the capacity to generate. We can have a generative model. People talk about that as being one of the sort of core aspects of Bayesian, our sort of Bayesian understanding of the world, some sort of generative model. Helmholtz is associated with that. Actually, some people copied it, work in the Arabic world from 800 years beforehand. But you can see that we don't really have the capacity to have a pixel level imagination about what might actually happen. Even if if you look at the way that artificial devices like these GAN networks or the VAEs or these other things that you can see in artificial intelligence, they are obviously capable of generating these beautiful pictures, right? So we don't have the sort of generative model that allows us to generate pictures in quite that way. So that sort of imagination process isn't veridical in that way. And of course, it doesn't need to be, because you have a memory to do something. You have a memory, so from a planning perspective, you have a memory because you want to do it. it in order to make good choices in the future. And so rendering every pixel in a scene is not something which is going to help you make a good choice in the future any more than actually seeing every pixel in the scene is helping you make a good choice now. So we have to, the brain has operationalized memory in a different way, but it's clear that some of the same structures are involved in future thinking and past thinking get linked together, and that then of course is a big clue as to aspects of how they may work.
Mm-hmm. And of course we have the memory, but we need to access this memory, right? Do you implement some kind of aspects? Is there any aspect of your modeling that actually implements this idea, or if you want, modules, right?
Yeah, so a long time ago with a former student, Zavalch Kali, we got interested in a debate that happened in the world of the hippocampus at the time between sort of multiple traces theory from Lynn Liddell versus a more standard sort of theory from Larry Squire about how you think about this consolidation. And so what Squire was arguing is for this consolidation process, a bit like Marr, right? You read it into there, Marr said, well, the hippocampus has to be appropriately sized. You can store all the events of a day, like 10 to the 5 events. He sort of decided with that sort of a rough number. You could then sort of squirt that and you decide which ones are actually worth storing, and then you squirt those into the cortex, and then they're there for the future. And versus Liddell, he was arguing for this multiple trace theory, where basically the permanent site of episodic storage within the hippocampus in an interesting way. And there's some interesting evidence. So, for instance, the evidence that Squire was interested in at the time were these inverted U-shaped curves of memorability. So if you had somebody who had a hippocampal insult, the idea was that if a memory had already existed in cortex and it had already been written out and already been consolidated, then you'd still, even though the hippocampus was damaged, you would still be able to remember it because it was still there. It was there in the cortex. So, and then I can't remember who the investigator was, but they had a very clever idea of using TV shows that had only been in America that had only been on for one season. Right? These, they existed. There's a time when everybody watched TV, linear TV before the days of streaming shows and so forth. And then you could look at people on those characters and say, well, who would remember those? And of course, they were never sort of big topics in the conversation, likely to have been big topics in the conversation subsequently. So you could almost sort of crystallize the event at which, if the memory had been laid down, it would have been laid down there. And what you saw is that there was indeed one of these inverted U-shaped curves, which means that you forgot things that happened most recently, and then you were better at remembering them, that things that happened a long time ago if you had this hippocampal insult. And then, of course, you still have the forgetting curve as well. That's why you get this inverted U-shaped curve. But the time scale, the time constant for that was huge, like 10, 15 years or so. So even if you were having this consolidation process, it was not a consolidation process that was happening quickly. It was a consolidation happening slowly. And so therefore, you might just as well have had these events being stored in the hippocampus. So what Zavalch and I did, we're interested in, was to say, what would it be like to try and take a semantic network, a semantic memory, like a memory for statistical things, and embed individual episodic memories into that structure? And the answer is, from a computational perspective, at least the computational devices we were trying at the time, is it doesn't work very well. Because the semantic network, the semantic memory is there to work out general statistical characteristics, whereas the episodes say this particular memory is what you should care about, not the ones which are related to that very nearby, but this one you should have. And so we argue that makes some sense for this multiple trace theory, essentially. And that then leads to an interesting different problem, which is what we thought of the consolidation actually as being this consolidation type processes being involved in, it gets back to your question, which is about indexing, which is that you need to be able to index this memory, which means to say, well, I give you a new pattern or a new input. You have to say, well, which of these many memories you might have does it relate to? Can you get that back from? And the indexing problem is that in 15 years you learn a lot. Your brain has changed, dramatically. You've become an expert in something completely different than you were before, which means that the codes that you have now, in your current self, for describing those events that you stored in the hippocampus are now completely different. Mm-hmm. And that means that both the codes that you had in the hippocampus for what they are like are no longer valid, and your indexing relationship doesn't work either because you've got these things that are now wrong. Mm-hmm. So you need somehow to maintain. So we called it index maintenance. You need to somehow to maintain the indexing relationship between these. We argued you need to somehow maintain this indexing relationship between the cortex and the hippocampus. Mm-hmm. If you're going to have that sort of storage. And so it's about recall. How do you get this recall to work? And the computational problem that then the brain has to solve is, well, how do I make sure that this works, even though my representations are changing dramatically over the 15 years that I still have to be able to remember these entities? And so then we developed a theory around a consolidation of that. So indexing is really important. If you have the memory itself, that's good. And semanticization of memory is a interesting but limited way of doing memory. And there's an interesting patient called John in London. I think a patient of Farinay Vardakadem's, who was born with hippocampal, maybe had a hippocampal deficit. I think either born without hippocampus or maybe very early on in life. But amazingly, he has, he's got O levels, so he did, he's well educated. He is reported to taught himself. So, you learn something and then he repeats it again and again and again. So he's basically doing the consolidation operations that we would normally do using our hippocampus. Automatically, he does, I believe, in a self-generated way in order to store these things. So you would think of that as being the ultimate. I haven't tested it, and I don't know this literature super well, but as if he sort of semanticized the memory himself, such that then he has this statistical aspect of memory. So he knows the facts, which is what the semantic memory gives you, without having the episodic memory that you would then we also have, that we would have because of our hippocampi.
So he kind of hacked the hippocampus and kind of is able to memorize by doing something else.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Very clever.
This is kind of the flexibility of the brain that we have, right? The plasticity, and probably some other region took over these functions.
Well, in this instance, it does. It sounds like it's more. It doesn't sound like there's another region to have the function. It's more that he had a behavioral. He used behavior to take it. If this description that I've given you is true, it'd be nice to actually go back and look at the basic literature. But if that description is true, then it's actually behavior has taken over rather. So he's got a plan, a policy, rather than another part of the brain. And it's interesting to ask, well, when do you actually have such developmental plasticity you can actually take over the function of part of the brain, versus when you have to have a different, you have to have a different way of essentially solving the problem. So we heard again in Horizons today, if you heard the talk in the neuroprosthetics about this gentleman who lost all his proprioception and all his stretch receptors and proprioception. So there's a book by Jonathan Cole called Pride in a Daily Marathon about this person. And then basically he had to look at he was constantly able to see his limbs in order to work out where they are. And then, the description that was given in the Horizons is, when the lights went off in the lift, he basically crumbled to the floor because he couldn't see any aspect of himself. So there he has a behavioral, no part of the brain or body could take over from the stretch receptors. You can't find, you don't have proprioception in that case. You can't solve it, but you can solve it behaviorally by using vision, right? So he learned how to use vision in order to do this. And so likewise, you have, there are these people who are blind who click, who basically use echolocation. It's not something that we have an organ for echolocation in the way that a bat has or a dolphin has an organ for echolocation, but we have the capacity to develop behaviors, and then through plasticity we can then embed them and maybe habitize them, and then we can just use them in order to take over from an otherwise what would be a deficit.
Alexander Luria actually has very interesting books studying exactly this kind of phenomena when people have damage to their brain and what happens and how you have to learn by writing a book. And it's incredible that we take everything for granted, right? Our vision, our hearing, but at the end, the brain makes the world comes together on place, and we just don't understand that how incredible this device in our head is.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Speaking of indexing, memory, location, what about time? What is the relationship? Because when we memorize about something, we always know, or most of the cases, we know, oh, this happens 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 5 minutes ago. How do we relate this to memory, learning, and probably decision making?
So, time plays a very, very rich and difficult role in decision making. So there's a lot of decision making that happens in short periods of time. So we'll get to the long periods of time in a minute, but let's think of it even just about short periods of time. So we have what psychologists call this interval timer. So we have a very flexible but rather inaccurate timer for sort of relatively shortish intervals, whereby the variance, so our uncertainty about timing, grows not with the mean of the timing that you have. So if you want to time for 3 seconds, the uncertainty versus 10 seconds, the uncertainty, instead of growing from 3 up to 10, grows from 9 up to 100, basically. So you have become much more uncertain. And that's important because it means that our ability to do these timing doesn't get better, long intervals doesn't get better as you time long intervals. So it's actually important from a modeling perspective, and it's important from a perspective. On the other hand, we also have a circadian timer, which is actually pretty good, right? So that busts that time regime. We probably have like sub-millisecond timers too. So there's a lot of interesting debate in the literature about what sort of time. There's no timing organ, right? There's not like a sensory system which does timing in the same way that we have time, like a visual system or auditory system. And time, there's interesting work on the striatum involved in timing, the cerebellum involved in timing, and many investigators have been thinking about these in different contexts. And you can see that people have there's some particular diseases like Parkinson's disease where people have problems with aspects of timing which come in these rather rich ways, which have been quite revealing to some. People have done, like Sam Kirshman has done some lovely work thinking about what how timing might work in a way that then can be illuminated by this. So and then even in the prediction work for dopamine, for instance, so the work that we talked about, this temporal difference learning, we know that if you have an animal which makes a prediction of a cue comes on and maybe a second later, like for a macaque, or like a second half later, for instance, it expects a reward. If it doesn't get a reward, then we have a negative prediction error. You get less reward than you expected in the terms we talked about before. You see a well-timed dip in the activity of dopamine cells at the time that the reward should have been there. And in some sense, that's the best evidence that we have that the animal predicted reward at that time. Therefore, it was keeping time, right? And we know that also from eye blink conditioning and many other conditioning cases too. And the interaction between the striatum and the cerebellum and other areas that might be involved in timing is very, very important for that. Now, the issue about what it is to remember time for to store an event with time 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that I don't know the work on that. I think it's an interesting idea. We could speculate about how you lots of different things change over time, right? So one way to think about how you work out what the time is, you say, well, how far away is the current of something about the current event from what it was before? So in fact, Misha Ahrens, an investigator when he was working with Manish Sahani as a student in London, he built a model of this interval timing I was talking about based on exactly that. So how many events were there essentially? And you think it's like it's a particular, and then we know that this short interval timer is influenced by events that you see. So if you watch a slow motion movie, then your notion of time is slowed down. If you watch a fast movie, then the fast movie, the aspect of time goes up. So if you listen to this podcast at twice the speed, then you're going to you will change your perception of time accordingly. So you can imagine that something similar could happen at a much larger time, at a much different time scale where you think about events. But I've not something I've ever worked on. But I think it's an interesting question about how good is our sense of time? Like, what's the scaling properties of that? And then maybe we remember it associated with a set of events that we have. But one thing we do know is that our metacognition, our meta-memory is sometimes called out. So our metacognition for memory has some interesting flaws. So these ideas about these sort of like flashbulb memory. So people look at these cases where some catastrophe happened, like the challenge of blowing up or 9/11, for instance, and people, there's ambulance chasing psychologists who go around. They try to say, well, what are you actually doing on this day? They can come back 5 years later and say, do you remember? What do you think you were doing? And what you see is that people are absolutely sure about what they were doing. Many people are absolutely sure about what they were doing at that time, but in fact they're wrong. And so we aren't. So there are aspects of our memory for the past which isn't well reflected by our metacognition about those aspects of memory, and which is a very, very interesting problem. It'd be nice to know whether aspects of memory about time. I'm sure maybe there may be a big body of work on this. Not something I've worked on myself.
It's actually very interesting that people with Parkinson have this disturbance in their sense of time. But it makes sense if dopamine plays a role, since these dopaminergic neurons are degenerating in Parkinson's patients, right? So people, they do not have that much dopamine in their system. So probably, as you described, indeed, dopamine is very important.
Yes, but the interesting challenge, so that's absolutely true, and that makes perfect sense. But the interesting challenge is the following, which is that if the sort of naive model is you have a clock, right? And so the clock is ticking by, and you think, well, maybe the clock's going slowly if you haven't got very much dopamine. But if I ask you to time an interval, and what you do is say, well, how many times did the clock tick, right? Then if the clock's going fast, maybe you get 15 ticks. If the clock's going slowly, maybe you get 5 ticks. But you wouldn't expect a bias in your estimate of time merely because the clock is going slowly, unless you learned when the clock was going fast, and now you're trying to express that now the clock is going slowly. So that became one of the paradoxes in the issue about timing. So it's clear that dopamine is involved in timing, and there's work about a big protection structure of the dopamine is the striatum. And there's work from Joe Patton showing if you warm up or cool down the striatum, you can actually change the speed of timing of mice in a particular experiment, the interesting experiment that he did. So dopamine is involved in time, but it's not quite as simple as one might hope. And this experiment, I think, sort of shows that nicely.
Speaking of dopamine, can you elaborate on the role of dopamine in decision-making and reward, for example?
Yes. So dopamine is as you know, it's a neuromodulator, which means that it's one of these systems which is a more general system in the brain. So dopamine neurons, they come from fairly small nuclei in this instance in the midbrain. They have quite wide projections, not as wide as some other neuromodulators like norepinephrine, which goes much more generally. And for a long time, we knew, because it had been observed that dopamine neurons are dying in Parkinson's disease, and other neurons are also dying in Parkinson's disease, but dopamine neurons in particular. And that was then associated with a bunch of phenomena in terms of motor, particularly bradykinesis, so slow movement, and also rigidity and tremor and so forth. So people had very many interest to study dopamine. And then one of the observations that Wolfram Schultz made by recording from monkeys very early on is that although doing experiments where he was basically trying to tease out the motor aspects of dopamine, is he found that the activity of dopamine cells in his macaque monkeys was much better associated with rewards and events that predicted rewards than it was with the actions that those events inspired, right? So you could say maybe an animal is going to sees a cue which says that there's like a piece of reward. Let's say he originally had them like a piece of apple on a wire in front of an animal, and so the animal could then got a cue, could then go and reach for the reward, and you could then say, well, is the activity of my dopamine cells, is it associated with the cue, or is it associated with the time in which the animal made the action? You think, well, if it's associated with motor actions, maybe it should be associated with the action. If it's associated with the cue, then maybe it's associated then it should be better time with respect to the cue, and that's what he found, is better time with respect to the cue. So that's one of the sort of key pieces of evidence that we think of dopamine being involved in reward processing. And then also we know that in, for instance, almost all drugs of addiction, one of their modes of action involves controlling either the release of dopamine, the longevity of dopamine, or other aspects of the way that dopamine is functioning. Now, so we can see that clearly for sort of dopaminergic drugs, cocaine, amphetamines, and so forth. And then there are, and then there's also paths for other drugs like nicotine and so forth too. So lots of reasons to think that dopamine might somehow be involved in reward. Now, in the temporal difference world, there's a nuance to that, which is that, as I mentioned, we're interested in this notion of secondary conditioning. So there, something which predicts reward takes on some of the power of a reward itself. So if the light predicted reward, that means the tone, by predicting the light, the tone comes to predict something about reward too in these particular models. So that means that now, if the light comes on, and that causes the release of dopamine, so the light is not itself a reward. It's a predictor of future reward. And so what we then learn by thinking also about dynamic programming, this body of theoretical work, which then ties into this way that reinforcement learning works, what we learn then is that we're interested in changes, either reward itself or changes in state, so changes in our expectations about the future. And so a positive change about expectation of the future acts a little bit like a reward itself. In fact, they get in the temporal difference prediction error, they get exactly added together. So the reward itself, and then the difference between the value you thought you had, the value you think you have now, and the value you thought you had before. So we have a richer notion of prediction error that comes in these temporal difference learning rules. And so now getting better is in some sense just as good as being good, right? So reward itself and things that are getting, states that are getting better, have some similar properties to each other, and that means that and indeed it makes sense that you want to reinforce actions which go from bad to neutral just as much as you want to reinforce actions that go from neutral to good. But that means that reward has then sort of disappeared, right? Because we've now created some fake reward for ourselves, which has to do with how things are changing. And so that's a super important aspect of the way that dopamine operates, and it's an important aspect of the way that these things work in terms of reinforcement learning too. And so we have to enrich our notions of reward. And it turns out that then dopamine has, and then one of these heuristic that we were talking about, or we think, and it's quite a bit controversial in the field. There's interesting debates. There's really active area of research at the moment that you see that that dopamine is not only involved in valence, so positive valence, things that are better than they were expected, but it's also involved in invigoration. So remember my experiment with these four quadrants. So it looks like dopamine is involved in both the go and the win, which is why it's difficult, we imagine, for it to do a no-go to win. And there's some data looking at how the brain then essentially that we interpret. So Kevin Lloyd, one of my scientists in my department, using some data from Mark Walton, have tried to argue that that dopamine becomes an instrument that control processes in the brain use to affect a certain sort of outcome action itself. So if you have a mandatory coupling between invigoration and dopamine, then that's something that you can then if you're a part of the brain that then can control dopamine, who controls the controller, then you can also control action in this particular way too. And so we think of this as being a sort of control device that the brain itself uses as an instrument of sort of cognitive control in a way. But that's a bit more of a complicated story than you probably have time for.
In these lines, what do you think about this kind of a trend? It was trendy actually a couple of years ago, of people depriving themselves of this rewarding activity so that they can experience this dopamine release afterwards in a greater level. Does this make any sense? Or
this dopamine detox you mentioned, so it's not something I had come across before. We can imagine something that could potentially make sense, and certainly there's a what's sometimes called this hedonic treadmill, which is that if it was the case that dopamine is telling you when things are getting better, then you have a prediction, right? So as soon as something, you're in a new state of the world, then your prediction rises to whatever the level of what that new state of the world is, and then you need to have more dopamine to get. You have something better has to happen, better still, right? There's a sort of and that's why it's called a treadmill, because you never quite catch up. You're just always going on. So it's clear that if you force yourself to get off that treadmill for a little bit, then now the things you need to do in order to get back to having dopamine again, if that's the goal in this thought experiment, then you can see why that would then make it then accessible, because you can't always you can't just keep on ever getting more and more exhausting more and more resources and so forth and so forth. So that makes you could imagine we can tell ourselves a story about how that makes a little bit of sense. And certainly this hedonic treadmill is a big problem, and these are comparison issues that also happen where we compare ourselves against other people, and then those comparisons then are an important aspect of how we evaluate ourselves then becomes important too. There's another interesting point that comes up with that, which is a bit about control, so controllability. So, and this I think comes back to a bit to psychiatric disease as well, which is that one of the things that we're battling with ourselves about how we do is how much control we are able to exercise over ourselves now. And if we are able to do that, then what that predicts about ourselves, our future selves, right? So essentially, we're engaged in an interesting debate with our future selves about what you expect to be able to do in the future. So if you're on a diet, for instance, and you defect in your diet now, then rationally you think, well, I'm going to defect on my diet in the future too, right? And so, but if you think, well, I am going to be strong and avoid this sort of defection, so I bind myself to the mast, which is the way that people like George Ainsley looks at it. There's a very interesting book on exactly this topic, using the ideas about hyperbolic discounting, then it makes a prediction that maybe in the future I think that I will also be able to control things as I need to, and therefore therefore things will be better for me in the future because I am able to exert this control. And so in some sense I'm deriving present value from the controllability that I expect to be able to exert in the future. And so it's one of these ways that you get this sort of generalized sense of how the future influences the present in terms of what you do. So you might essentially be almost like making a little bet to myself: am I able to avoid the things that are normally pleasurable to me, like going on my dopamine detox essentially? And that could be a sort of signaling, a self-signaling device is one way to think about it. The psychologists would think about it. Or economists. And so that self-signaling has a present value. See, well, if I can control myself, then I expect to be able to control myself in the future too, and that will actually be good. If I can't control myself now, I don't have that right to expect myself in the future, and therefore things may go badly in the future as well.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I would like to shift the topic a little bit and ask you the following question. So I'm studying the synapses, and in particular some kind of organization around the synapse, the extracellular matrix, which is stabilizing the synapses, these are the connections between the two brain cells, as we know that to some extent might be storing partial memory, right? And of course, not only in one synapse, the whole cell and the computational pattern, how the cell is firing, for example. This can be kind of a underlying principle of biological memory, if you want, right? Then we have this kind of synaptic level, circuitry level. Then we have this systems level, different systems communicate within each other. Then we have the whole brain activity and this cognition that arises from all of these processes. I'd like to ask you the following. To what extent do we need to know all the details along this ladder in order to fully understand our behavior or decision making, for example?
I should say you left out the communication between individuals. Like there's a social aspect
as
well.
Next level.
Next level
Yes,
as well.
yes.
So you use the word fully, right? So by saying you want to learn it fully, we obviously are not able to avoid ourselves about learning about any of the aspects. So I think a reformulation of the question is, if what you care about is the systems level, you care about how people interact with each other, going to interact with each other, for instance, then under what circumstances does a detail at the synaptic level have an impact on that behavior? The short answer is we don't yet know, and there almost certainly are cases where that really becomes important, where there's details about the way that about the details of synaptic plasticity and the way that these things are formed, which actually can have an impact on, which will in the end indeed have an impact at the macroscopic level, because the system is beautifully regulated in order to try and to try and avoid that happening. But at some point, those things happen. You can see that in Parkinson's disease, where the number of dopamine neurons that have to die before you start to have obvious behavioral deficits is huge, right? 80-90% of the neurons will have died before you see noticeable bradykinesia and so forth. So there's a wonderful amount of robustness in the system which avoids some of those problems. But then we know that then, particularly if you're interested in disease, that then the details of how these systems operate become really important, and then the nature of the disease and maybe potentially ways of ameliorating this disease really become important. That's where robustness breaks down. So generally, biology has developed hugely robust systems, which means that from a systems level, we can often think at a systems level because the the heuristics that are embedded at these lower levels are not don't raise themselves to have an impact at the systems level. Clearly in disease, that's not the case. And there'll be other cases where it's not the case either. And so in general, we mentioned briefly this MAR notion about computational algorithmic implementation. And so people criticize MAR, or I think not completely correctly, for, and actually Poggio was interested in these ideas too, for arguing top down, to start off with what the problem is. In fact, the way I described the issue of the way we're thinking about in reinforcement learning, the same way, that we had to change the notion of what the problem was itself. But in fact, Rich Sutton actually knew a lot of the psychological data as well. So really, we want to go both top down and bottom up at the same time. And there's no point in having a beautiful, crystalline computational theory, because I argued, in fact, those computational theories in real cases are they're not going to work because they're much too computationally complicated. And in the end, biology will have built its heuristics, and it builds heuristics out of the mechanisms it has available to it. So we were talking about memory, right? So the issue about how much storage, how long can you store something? How can you store something at a synaptic level? How long does it get to persist? Or if your proteins have to turn over at like an astonishingly fast rate compared to the length of time you want to remember something for, then the way that they turn over, the mechanisms that we need to have in order to make that work, and dangers of things that can happen if for instance, you have sleep deprivation. If sleep is important for some of those aspects, then you will see in the end synaptic changes that happen during sleep, which are really critical for this. If you don't sleep, those synaptic changes won't happen. Catastrophe. What the nature of that catastrophe will be determined by the nature of the synaptic changes you have. So I think that there are, you can't get away from the details in some cases, but that doesn't mean that you always have to have all the details in your mind when you're building these theories. And then, as ever, it's an iterative scheme where you start off with a theory and then a simple theory. It's like a Newtonian filter, right? We had to have Newton's theory of gravity to get to Einstein's theory of gravity because otherwise it's way too complicated. But having done that, we can now look for some of the complexities. And the same is true for things like dopamine, where you might have a simple theory about how dopamine neurons work, where you imagine it's almost like a scalar. It's just one number, just one single prediction error. Then, as a result of that, that then it becomes important to do the experiments, you can see, well, no, it's heterogeneous. There are lots of other things going on. So then what are they? What's important about them becomes really critical. And so the same will be true for the work in synapses as well.
And what if we invert the question and look at it from the perspective of what can these modalities, this knowledge about the synapse, the channels, if you want, the protein turnover, etc., if we add this knowledge to some computational or let's say neural network, how can this enrich the model? I mean, we see now in the neural network, for example, deep learning, if you want, we have these nodes, connections, layers, and basically they mimic the connectivity of one cell with, let's say, 100 errors and the activity and the backpropagation. And then we have only like simple communication between different cells, if you want, neurons. However, we can recapitulate a lot of interesting aspects of how the brain actually works, right? What can we benefit if we add these other modalities? What do you think about that?
So we have to distinguish the engineering aspects of deep learning systems from their how close are they to what can we learn about the neurobiological system? Maybe we'll talk about that later. So in many cases, important cases, the engineering problems that computational devices suffer from are very different from the engineering problems that biology suffers from when it was trying to build systems. So it's having to cope with things like protein turnover, whereas a computer doesn't have to cope with protein turnover, right? If it wants to store something, it can store something. And in fact, it has lots of internal, dynamic RAM, exactly as doing a turnover mechanism to store it. But it doesn't have to be something, it's something which can be nicely encapsulated. It doesn't have to happen on an active basis. And these days, you have very good static RAMs as well. So quite a lot of those mechanisms are down to the particular hardware we have. And, we have this wonderfully energy efficient hardware device, which can basically, do all these computations on a ham sandwich. Whereas, there's the guys who did IBM, the Deep Blue were pointing out, compared to computers, which operate in a very different energy regime, basically, where they can store things in different ways. They're using different sorts of technology and so forth. So we don't yet know what aspects of these are just because the biological substrate, the amount of energy we can have, and the devices, we're using, these proteins that we're using to store things, are solutions to that. And what aspects of them are solutions to the wider problems which the system faces? Like, we want to do memory. So take something like catastrophic interference, right? So that's, since we're talking about memory, that's a big problem for computational systems too, right? So they learn something now. We talked about, in 15 years, we're learning other things. How do we keep track of, how do we stop forgetting what it is we could do before that we can actually do it now? So there are ideas in computational devices for doing that, which are probably very different from the way that we do it ourselves. And maybe the nature of synaptic plasticity that we have, maybe it would give us clues as to how we cope with some of those problems, and those clues might then be very useful for thinking, for getting other ideas about how to do this and solve this in an engineering perspective too. But we should bear in mind that even if the outline of the solution that we see in deep networks looks not 100% unlike the outline of the solution we have in the brain too, the engineering questions are very different, and and also the sort of training methodology is very different. So we are an evolved system. They're something which typically they start off from learning everything from their common crawl from huge amounts of data that they have, because they're operating in a completely different regime. And so some of those things we don't know where that dividing line exactly is, I think.
If we can speculate a little bit, how do you see the, let's say, next couple of years in terms of development of neuroscience and AI, and how these two fields interact with each other and benefit from each other?
So a lot of the benefit, I must say, is from AI to neuroscience at the moment. So we see that benefit most simply in data processing methodology. So in neuroscience, as we are, like every other natural science, we're generating huge amounts of data. And so these machine learning devices are then great for doing that data processing. Also, with the advent of these deep learning networks and so forth, we now finally have devices which are capable of solving information processing problems a bit like the sorts of information processing problems that we solve ourselves, and therefore we were short of good models in the good artificial models that we could use to give us hints about things like representation. For instance, how is it that the brain represents aspects of the world? if we didn't have a device that could do that, we didn't have anything that we can compare ourselves to, and think about that. So I think that's been very important work, and many other, I haven't done this sort of work myself, but many investigators have done work along those lines and said, okay, well, now can we learn something about representations that we wouldn't have understood, and maybe we can learn something about the limits of how well we are likely to be able to understand the representations, because we can see that we can see what it the problem of understanding representation in one of these large language models, for instance, it becomes radically complex. We can say, well, okay, well, now hang on, we try to do the same thing in the brain itself. So in that context, there's a lot of interest now in using these methods that we see in AI. Now, the other way, it's a little bit harder to see. Obviously, there are key aspects of neural architectures which have been very influential. And I think there are key aspects of cognitive problems which are very influential, because we want these devices to do the things that we do. And therefore it makes sense to think about those in that way. And those cognitive problems often have been informed by neuroscience as well. So, and you could think of cognitive psychology and neuroscience, they sort of nicely, they meet in a nicer, fluid way. So it's not that there's no relationship there, when we think about catastrophic interference and things like that. So things that the brain still seem to do much more flexibly than these artificial devices. Those become important, and we've talked about some of the areas along those lines. But at some point, the engineering solution runs away from us, right? And so then in the end, now the commercial imperative for these AI devices is quite different. It's there to act to solve problems, and there's no reason why they should care about the way that we solve the problems. And if you look at the Jeff Hinton's Jeremiad about the dangers that he sees in AI systems, it's coming because the nature of the solution is very different for these different systems. And so I think that that's like a baseline that we need to think about a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, we produce tons of data in neuroscience, but not only, right? We live in a data-driven society right now with all this social media and etc. around it. And there's this bizarre question that I wanted to ask you. I don't know if you're familiar with Isaac Asimov's book, The Foundation. And there the main character, Harry Seldon, he develops this kind of science psychohistory where he predicts the future of the galaxy based on historic events, right? Do you think we will be able to develop some kind of similar science, if you want, to predict the near future based on our behavior? Because we have now tons of data in some social media and other domains, and we can gather, organize somehow, and think about something weird like that.
So the question here is, how far ahead can we predict? And the trouble with that is that, and indeed, I'm not super familiar with the I read them a long time ago when I was a while ago. But how, he was trying to predict, at a scale of, I believe, hundreds of years or something, a very, very long time horizon. And I think that our ability to predict at that time horizon is terrible, right? So certainly we have a lot of data, and that allows us to local prediction. But you can see that, look at economics, right? So economics is essentially, what they're trying to do is make these sorts of predictions, right? In some aspect, I think about macroeconomics. And at some level, we can make interesting predictions. We know there are going to be cycles, things go up, things go down, and so forth. But then the shocks that happen to the system, and there are so many aspects of sorts of chaos that whether it's formally chaos or not, that destroy our capacity to make detailed predictions of what's going to happen. And you think, okay, well, what sorts of predictions could we make, and how well are we going to be able to understand the way that these human systems are going to interact with, take over the medium-term timescale, things like climate change, for instance. What the consequence of climate change is going to be. We know some of the forces that are happening, but understanding the effect of that on political systems, for instance, like refugees and so forth, many aspects like that are extremely hard to predict, and they're sensitive also to individuals, right? And so you think of, we all can see in different countries, how individuals can have a big effect, which itself is an interesting aspect of how we as a species operate in terms of the way that we believe people, the way that our actions then get influenced by those sorts of characteristics that we can see in the world, and that we haven't talked much about the social construct, the thing that was left out before. But we know many aspects of how that leads to huge difficulties in prediction because of the deception and sort of Machiavellian thinking, and essentially we are devices which are trying to cope with that the complexity which we then create, and that then leads to lots of interesting issues that are going to make a Seldonian prediction extremely difficult.
These are the so-called black swans, right? As Nassim Taleb describes in his book, that events that we cannot predict, but they disturb the system to a great extent, right?
Yeah, and it's because the system doesn't have any reason to be. It's not a negative feedback controlled system, right? There are many instances where there's positive feedback that leads us. We have positive kind of exponents to use this sort of formal jargon in a way, and so a drop of water in a lake, everything nicely disappears because of energy conservation. But one individual who acts in a particular way can have a dramatic effect on a society, and that and there's a positive feedback process. And of course, you can argue that things like social media have then enhanced the speed at which those positive feedback processes happen, and maybe also the magnitude of those positive feedback processes, and that adds instability to the system in a way that we have yet to understand how to damp.
Professor Dayan, I enjoy our discussion a lot, but I must say to our listeners that it's already 9:30 in the evening. So although I would like to talk to you for hours, I think you're tired already from the conference and you are having a talk tomorrow. So I would like to conclude our first part of the discussion